My guest today is the creative genius behind acclaimed works such as The Bridge Home, A Time to Dance, Island's End, and Climbing the Stairs. Her literary prowess has earned her a multitude of prestigious awards. This author's journey goes beyond writing. She's explored oceans and rainforests and been the only woman of color on marine research ships. Yet her impact reaches even further. Our guest is a passionate advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion, championing these ideals through keynote addresses, writing workshops, and participation in festivals and conferences worldwide. Her commitment to mindfulness shines through her facilitation of meditation sessions and dedications to teaching yoga. Ladies and gentlemen, get ready to meet this extraordinary individual at the heart of our discussion today. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to award-winning author and scientist, Dr. Padma Venkatraman.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you so much for being here. I've already said this to you before, but I am just blown away by your commitment to the cause, by the amount of time you have taken to do such extensive research on my background and the attention to detail. I am just absolutely thrilled every time I meet a young person like you, and it gives me so much hope for the future.
Thank you for that compliment. Your kind words mean so much to me. Your novels often tackle themes of diversity and social justice. Can you share how your personal experiences, including your background and career as a scientist and teacher, have influenced your storytelling and your commitment to these themes?
So I think probably the novel of mine that has drawn most greatly from my oceanography background is Island's End, which unfortunately is not around anymore. Actually, I just realized that I don't have my books with me. Should I walk over, Christopher, to the other part of the house where they are?
Yeah, sure. Why not? Let's show us.
We'll keep this real. And then I can pull it out and show it to you. But, Island's End is probably the novel of mine that has drawn on my oceanography background the most. And even though it does actually draw on my oceanography background, one thing that Island's End does very differently than I do, then it isn't a replica of something that happened to me. It isn't a memoir. And in that way, I think all of my novels have something of my experience in them, but they are not directly reproductions of what happened to me. So they are slightly different looks. This, for instance, was the first, I think, South Asian novel that looked at something through the lens of magic realism for young people. And unfortunately, it's not in print anymore, maybe because it was too new at the time. But in some way, I think each of my novels has this passion that I have for diversity and equity and inclusion. And I think it is something that I experienced most closely when I was an oceanographer and I went to the Andaman and Nicobar Islands off the coast of the Indian Ocean. It was a fantastic place. It was a very isolated environment. And being there, I lived in close proximity to tribes that we would consider primitive. And I realized how much knowledge so many people held that the modern world just doesn't acknowledge or does away with. And it really forced me to see that, we say these things about like, oh, everybody's equal, but to actually have meaning in a very realistic way, I think that was the place that it happened to me. When I was, young and I was on those islands, that was something that was so important to me. And also, when I was 19, I left, home and family and everything that I knew in India. And I left and I first went to England and then I came a year later to America. And, leaving at that young age, going to another country, especially when I came to America, I had this illusion that this country was, it had all sorts of problems in the past, but everything was in the past and everything was gone. And now everything was fantastic. And everybody was so equal and here. And it was a shock to me when I was a graduate student and in oceanography in Virginia. I had all sorts of very racist things happen to me. And that really opened my eyes to what existed and the legacy of racism and how it continues on to the present day. And it also, I think, made me see myself as a person of color. So I never had any other identity in this country, and it shaped my racial lens and made me see myself very much as a person of color.
You mentioned some what you call primitive people on
Yeah.
these islands. And you also say they have knowledge that some modern people don't have. Do you
Yeah.
mind giving some examples of this knowledge?
Certainly. I mean, in a larger way, I think there's a knowledge of medicinal plants. There's a knowledge of the interconnectedness of things that I think we don't really have anymore in a deep sense. There's a knowledge of the ways that that things work and respond to the environment. A really good example is that there was a tsunami that rolled all over the globe. Probably you're way too young to remember it, but it happened quite a while ago. We call it the Boxing Day tsunami in some circles. But anyways, when that happened, the modern world was completely caught unawares, and the traditional people on the islands, on the Andaman Islands, knew, and they moved themselves to safety. So that's one practical example.
Your book, The Bridge Home, has touched the hearts of many readers, shedding light on the lives of homeless children in India. What inspired you to write this story, and what message do you hope readers, particularly young readers, take away from it?
So, The Bridge Home is a novel that I think was probably the hardest for me to write, because one of the things that it came from was a very difficult childhood that I have. And for the most part, I think when you meet, especially South Asian authors in this country, they've had relatively, usually, wealthy lives, relatively privileged lives. And for me, that was not quite the case. So I came from this really wealthy, very, very rich family. But then when I was about 7 years old, my dad basically kicked my mom and me out of the house. So suddenly, in this culture where divorce and separation were very uncommon, my mom found herself a single mother. And I suddenly went from thinking that, polo ponies and getting up in this mansion were a normal thing, to being in a teeny tiny apartment with my mom and realizing that all these, and a library I had taken for granted, all of this stuff was no longer mine. And so I think that was a shock. But what prevented me at that point from being really, sitting around feeling sorry for myself, because I was getting bullied a lot at school, because kids can sometimes bully people just because they're different, right? We say, sometimes adults think that, kids are all fantastic, which we're not necessarily. And I think it was very, like I said, it was very unusual to have any kid with two living parents who were not together. And so I got teased a lot because of that. And obviously the sudden, change in terms of being very wealthy and then not being very wealthy. And I was at a school where there were still very wealthy kids. So that, all of that brought its own, baggage in that way. But my mom, who had, until that point, she had been a wealthy woman giving money to charity. She couldn't do that anymore. But even though she was working so hard to keep a roof over her head and put food on the table, she made time to volunteer in schools where there were kids who had much less than me. So kids like the kids in the Bridge Home, right? And those kids were the kinds of kids who were living on the street. They did not have necessarily parents. They did not have even the kind of roof I had. They had no idea where their next meal was coming from. And some of these kids I met at, the kinds of places that my mom worked. And one of them told me her story. And, we got to be good friends. Those kids never teased me. And she said to me, because I was always scribbling, I had, I have notebooks galore, since we're having a movable thing. You can see a bunch of notebooks maybe on one of those shelves. I love them. I love to scribble in them. I always did. And she said, Padma, will you write my story one day? And I promised her that I would. And that became The Bridge Home. Not verbatim, but inspired by that.
In addition to being an author, you are also involved in advocating for diversity and inclusion in literature. Could you tell us about your initiatives, such as the Diverse Verse Initiative and hashtag Authors Take Action, and why you believe representation is crucial in literature?
I think representation is crucial in the world. And I think that when we create the world of literature is the world of our imagination. And if in the world of our imagination, we have no place for certain kinds of people, then there is something seriously wrong. And then we are probably going to continue to enact that in the world. And I think that's one of the most important reasons why we need a world in which there can be diversity represented in every way. That's one of the many reasons. And I think it, when you open a good book, right? Uh, Anyone who's had that experience of suddenly sometimes you feel transported right to another world, or sometimes you feel like you are maybe going into a different time or something. But I think the most important thing that a book can do is it can put you in someone else's mind and in someone else's heart, and then you are even in their character's body, because when the character is afraid or something's threatening the character, your heart starts to beat faster, right? And that's what a good book can do. And to me, that kind of merging of identity for a brief while with a character is caused by human compassion. So I feel like every time that you read a book that you love, which is a book that can do that, you're engaging in an act of compassion, in a way, of compassionate imagination. And that to me is so important. And I think another thing that a book does very much is this, right? So, Christopher, if you read a book of mine, my name may be on the book, but the book is actually being recreated in your mind. And I feel like in that process, we're both co-authors, It wouldn't exist without the two of us. And that is so powerful that even after I am dead and gone, somebody might pick up a book and still have that experience. And it is just this magical thing to me that we have created. But I think when I began to see, quite young actually, that the world of literature, that this magical thing that was the book didn't have space for me in it, I was shocked. And that's one of the reasons that I advocate so much for literature. So when I was a kid growing up in India, we still did not see dark-skinned people in literature that were heroes, except for mythological sorts of things, or fantastical. And that's part of the reason why, even though I have fantasies in me, I haven't been attracted to them, to writing them or exploring them, was because realistic fiction didn't have realistic heroes like me, and or who looked like me, right, in those books. And so I think that was very important for me, to have that representation, to not have you and my daughter, who's probably about as old as you, and your generation still have that going on. That's, to me, shocking and sad. And I think that's why it was so important for me to try to work to change that. And as for the initiatives you spoke about, I'm so glad you mentioned them. Diverse Verse is an initiative that it is really focused on poetry, because I went once to the school and I had this lovely teacher. But when we were talking, and we were just talking about the importance of people of color in literature, she, off the top of her head, could not name 5 BIPOC women poets. And I thought that's something we need to change, right? We need to have diversity in poetry as well. So that's where that initiative came from. And Authors Take Action came very much from sort of my, activist desire to change things that are just not necessarily always related to literature, but also in the real world, through through what we have as authors, through the people that we can contact as authors.
You have a strong background in both science and the arts. How do you find balance between your scientific pursuits and your writing? And do you see any connections between the two fields in your work?
I do. It's such a profound question. And again, Christopher, I can't tell you how impressed I am by the sensitivity of your questions, the depth of your questions. So one of the things I think that I take away from science is, as a scientist, initially going in, I didn't quite realize this, but scientists are very much into questions. And the way that you ask a question, the importance of a question, a well articulated question is so important. And to me, the best literature is spurred by questions. So if you look at my, my debut novel, Climbing the Stairs, it takes place in India during the Second World War. And the reason that I started writing it was because at the time that I was writing it, I was becoming an American citizen. And you know this, but some people might not, that if you are going to become, if you're born into being a citizen, then you don't have to do anything about it. But if you want to be a citizen, then you have to, do a lot of jumping through hoops. But you also have to swear that you will carry arms for this country. This country asks you to. And I was really asking myself, I was like, well, do I think I would? Because some people are like, those are just words, I'll just say them. But I want to only say things if I think that they're true, right, for the most part. And so I started to think about that, and my mind went back to a very different time and a very different place, India in the 1940s, where somebody in my family had asked that same question, because at that point, India was being ruled by the British. It was colonized. And so that's within my own generation. My mother grew up in a colonized country, and I'm just one generation away from that. And my grand uncle had this question in his mind about whether he should join sort of the Gandhian protest and the pacifist movement that was predominant in India, fighting for its freedom from British rule, or join the British to fight Hitler as part of the Allied World War II force. And very few people know that India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and all those countries which were called India at that time had the world's largest all-volunteer force during the Second World War. And my granduncle was part of that. And his story had never been told. And I really started to think, like, what was he doing? What was in his mind when he made this decision in this pacifist family to volunteer to be a soldier in this violent, but I think necessary war? And so that question was what spurred it. And there's no real answer. There's no complete answer. There's sometimes a good question has many different answers. You find that in science, you find that in writing. You asked about parallels. And I think having a book that is open-ended, that helps the reader ask the question for themselves and answer it their own way, that's really important to me.
Your commitment to mindfulness and yoga is evident in your life and work. Yeah. Can you share how these practices have influenced your writing and your approach to addressing social and environmental issues in your books?
That's again such a fabulous question. I'm looking because one of my books addresses that probably most directly, which is A Time to Dance. And A Time to Dance is a novel in verse. I think is the first South Asian Indian novel in verse in English for young people, I was told, which is very exciting for me. But this book is about a dancer, but it's also about a young person awakening to their sense of spirituality. And in A Time to Dance, it is seen, spirituality is seen through the lens of the Hindu religion. And to me, every religion is really, really like a pair of spectacles that, you put on and you see through those pair of spectacles. And what we're seeing out there is something nobody can really describe, maybe. And we think we have the answers sometimes, but we don't. And for me, it was really important in that book to portray concepts that are central to yoga and to mindfulness, because I grew up Hindu, but also with a large emphasis on Buddhist traditions and so on. And I've been doing yoga since the age of 7, actually. Right around the time that my parents split up is when I started. And my yoga teacher then, Krishnamacharya, is this wonderful, legendary yoga teacher. And so it's been a part of my whole life. And I think it helped to center me during the very difficult childhood that I had. It's helped to center me all through my life. And I wanted that and some of those concepts to be reflected in a way that was respectful, because I've seen a lot of books published, especially with young characters who are supposedly Hindu that are really disrespectful to the religion or really don't understand anything about it and are very superficial. And I wanted to change that. So that was one of the things that A Time to Dance did. But in other ways, just the practice of mindfulness, the practice of yoga has helped me, I hope, be a better mom. You should ask my kid that though. But also, I think, be a better person. It's very easy when hatred is directed toward you, when anger is directed toward you. It is so easy to internalize that and to be hateful and angry to that person back, right? And it's very hard not to be. And I think practices like yoga, like meditation, can help us realize that that is someone else's problem and we can turn it back to them instead of being transformed by it in a way that we don't want and becoming them or similar to them.
You mentioned how yoga can center yourself. Do you mind explaining what that means and other ways that yoga and mindfulness can help somebody?
Certainly. I think one way to look at it is that the mind and our thoughts, sort of like storms, they can batter your emotions. And when I say centering, I mean, to me, to root yourself in compassion, to root yourself in that, like a tree with very deep roots. And I feel like if you can stretch down and if you can feel this deep compassion, and if you can operate from, as much as possible, not every minute of the day, perhaps not all of us do it all the time, but to try to operate from that sense of compassion, then you're less likely to maybe say hurtful things or flippant things that cause harm unintentionally with your body. The other thing that I think mindfulness and, when I say centering myself as an author, it is so easy. This is not even so esoteric or anything, but it's really easy to be swayed by what people say about your book or not say about your book, or how many awards it got, or how many copies it sold, or how much money you made. And I see a lot of things like that do happen to people. You get caught up in this, and then you think you're a better author because you got some award, or you think you're a worse author because you didn't, or you get jealous of someone because they sold so many and you didn't. And that can, maybe it doesn't affect your writing, but it certainly does affect your home life. And I think that balance between, you point out I do science, I used to do science much more, but that balance between science and and a human being really, and being an author and being a writer, to find that the balance between those as well, I think you need to be, or it helps if you are centered in the sense that, again, you operate from something that is deeper than just what award you've received, right? So the rewards you reap from your work are much more meaningful and much deeper than that. I mean, just to actually, an example of that kind of reward would be, just this weekend, I was in a very tense situation and on a panel during which we were told, like, if people come in, here's the way that you run away, that sort of thing. So we really felt that physical threat. Nothing happened, thank goodness. And after that panel, a father who had been incarcerated walked up to me and thanked me for writing my book, Born Behind Bars. And just this morning, I read something that a mom had written, which was about how her son on Super Bowl Sunday was sitting in a corner crying over Born Behind Bars and the book that he had read. And I just loved that, and she said, thank you for doing that. And thank her and thank her son for keeping me, because sometimes in this business, you do wonder, you do think, am I making an impact? What's going on? And sometimes you think, should I leave? Should I, maybe go back to science? And I think when I hear stories like that, they help me to stay in the field. And people like you do that too.
Your encouragement keeps me centered. You have spoken at various events and workshops around the world. Could you tell us a particularly memorable moment or experience when discussing your love for books and your passion for diversity and inclusion?
There are so many wonderful things that have happened that it's hard to pin down to one. But again, I think the most meaningful things for me are when my books touch people's lives. And speaking of diversity, sometimes what happens is, you look at a book like this and you say, oh, there's an Indian girl on the cover. This is only for Indian women, or people who self-identify as somehow being of Indian heritage and female. And the thing that happened to me, which was so wonderful early on in my life, was that I had this young Latina woman walk up to me, and she said to me the reason she went to college was that she read Climbing the Stairs, and it gave her what she needed to do that. And that was just incredible, right? Because even there are so many similarities. So the book also has stuff on, how women were treated quite badly in Indian culture in the 1940s. And it's a little bit about my own mom's life. And to see that has this impact that is in this day, that happened to that reader, that was probably one of the most memorable moments for me, the most wonderful moments for me. And sometimes that kind of thing happens on the web even. And actually last year, I got a very similar letter from somebody in Peru who said she had also gone to college after reading Climbing the Stairs because it gave her that that confidence or whatever, that bit of inspiration. And that sort of thing is maybe the most memorable thing to me when it happens, to know that my book is maybe touching somebody in the world that I have never met and maybe never will meet, and made their lives better, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times, it does change their heart, but sometimes they don't know how to reach out to you, but know that it did, change a lot of people's lives.
Yeah.
As our conversation comes to a close, I'm deeply grateful for the profound insights shared by Dr. Padma Venkatraman. Her storytelling prowess goes beyond mere narration. It's a journey into societal injustices, diverse voices, and the transformative power of mindfulness. Her resilience and dedication to promoting diversity in literature are awe-inspiring. Through initiatives like Diverse Verse and #AuthorsTakeAction, she champions marginalized voices, urging us all to reflect and act. Thank you, Dr. Padma Venkatraman, for inspiring us all to harness the power of storytelling for social change.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It was a joy to be with you this afternoon.
Thank you so much. You were great answering all those questions.